Hello, and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records management, although at times I will also touch slightly on information and library science. These videos are designed to provide bite-sized chunks, which means that almost every video will be less than 15 minutes. These videos are honestly for everyone, and comments and suggestions are always more than welcome. About me, Sean McMillan. I'm an archivist based in London, and you can learn more about me via my LinkedIn profile, to which there is a link posted below. And I'll also post a transcript and notes also if you struggle at any point to understand my accent. And lastly, if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could kindly like, subscribe and share. Thanks again. Okay, so this video is about accessing archives. And this video is broadly aimed, I would say, at sort of two types of people. This will be for archivists and information professionals who are looking to learn more about how archives are physically made available, and also readers who have never accessed archival collections and are wondering what the processes and methods are. I also need to say that I'm recording this video on Guy Fawkes night, or quite close to it, so if you hear any bangs in the background, don't worry, no one's breaking in, I'm safe. Okay, so the first port of call should always be the catalogue and probably the institution's website. The institution's website should include key details about what catalogues they have, what collections they've catalogued, the opening hours, the amount of advance time you need to give them to retrieve materials, and the sort of logistics that the reader will need to keep in mind when they come to visit the materials. A catalogue, if you are not aware, is a finding aid which accounts for the contents of a collection. The catalogue should hopefully be online and provide details of what is and what is not available. That said, it's often the case that some archives will not catalogued their full collections, and sometimes just sending them an email is always worthwhile. Another important point to note is that if a collection is catalogued properly, it should have what's known as access details. So you might, for example, find an item or a description of an item that you really want to see, but I would always double check that if there's any access details, as sometimes materials can be restricted and it won't be possible to view it, or there might be conditions on access where the item is not restricted, but you can only sort of see it under certain circumstances. Okay, so the next aspect to consider is what I would call the reading room, and this is essentially a dedicated space for accessing archival materials and rare materials. This space will likely be monitored by a staff member, and there will also be restrictions on what you can and cannot bring into this room. So for example, they'll often have restrictions that you can't bring in water or food or pens. That's quite common. And it is always very important to you abide to these rules. Most reading rooms will offer lockers, so if you are bringing materials with you, then hopefully there'll be a place where you can put your materials while you view the archives. I'd also say that time can sometimes be limited, and unlike other library services, which may remain open for extended periods, it's not uncommon for archival reading rooms to close earlier than the libraries they're based within. And lastly, please remember that materials can often be stored in other areas or storage rooms that can be very far away from the physical reading room you see, and that asking for more materials may take a lot of time. Sometimes I think from a user perspective, there's maybe this sort of misleading perception that behind the wall of the reading room is just a storeroom of hundreds of archives. And in some cases that is true, but in many cases the actual storage facilities will be very far away from the archive. In other cases, it's possible that the storage facility may be in another location altogether. For example, I think the University of Oxford, they use a book storage facility that's based in Swindon. So just remember that the materials can often be very far away from the reading rooms, and that just emphasises the point of asking in advance. Okay, so I'm going to give some tips for readers and for people who are looking to access archival collections. And as mentioned, this is perhaps aimed at people who have little experience accessing archives and have maybe never been to an archive before and really don't know what to expect. The first thing I would say is try know as much as possible about what you want. So think very clearly about the actual collections you're looking for and the materials you're looking for, and if possible, be as specific as possible. Some archival collections can be huge. They can include several hundred boxes. If you can narrow down your interest to a couple of items or a couple of boxes, that would save everyone a lot more time and also help you as well. I'd also recommend checking for what's available online first before making a long journey. And I'm not talking about the online catalogue. I'm talking specifically about collections that have been digitised and put online. So, for example, Trove are an example of an Australian organisation who have digitised large quantities of content which are freely available online. I only say this because my undergraduate thesis involved looking at Australian archives, and fortunately I didn't need to travel to Australia. So again, looking at what collections have been digitised and put online is a huge advantage. In some cases, an archive are actually willing to scan it for you and send it over if you only need to see one document. And you know, if services like that exist, I would always explore them before making a very long trip. I would also recommend requesting materials in advance. I think I've said that a few times in this video. Most archives will ask for at least working day in advance if possible. And generally speaking, retrieving materials can be laborious, especially if there's a lot of people also requesting materials. As a personal point, I would often consider the notice period that they give in the website. I would be safe and treat that as the minimum. So if they say that they need a minimum of 1 day, I would ask maybe 2 days in advance just to be absolutely safe. And you could also follow up with an email before you visit that they definitely have the materials in question available. I'd also plan for note taking, as you often can't take items out of the reading rooms. This isn't like a library service. So I would recommend maybe clarifying if it's not on the website, maybe clarifying if you're allowed to take pictures or if you're allowed to sort of take pencils and sketch what you find. And I would also recommend getting used to how archival catalogues work and interpreting them. So this means being able to read what catalogues describe and being able to understand what the different fields are. I've done separate videos on this, but for example, it is useful to know about how the date ranges in catalogues work, or understanding the restrictions and access fields. I think having a better idea of this information will help you a lot when you go to visit an archive. The catalogue can often give you details about a collection and what language it's in, for example. And I think if you know that, if you can get that information from looking at the catalogue, it could save you a lot of time and effort. And lastly, I would also really encourage that you ask questions. From a personal perspective, I always really encourage feedback because I think it's the only way that you'll improve your service and make things better. Okay, and now some tips for archivists and people responsible for making collections accessible. The first thing I would say is, where possible, please try keep your information accurate. So by this, I'm referring to perhaps the web page that you use to advertise your collections. It's very important that the information on that web page is as up to date as possible. So for example, you'll want to tell prospective readers about what times they can visit. You might want to describe what sort of restrictions they have and things they can bring into the reading room. So for example, if you ban any type of food or liquid in your reading room, then I would probably mention that just to be as clear as possible. You would maybe also want to describe, you'd maybe also want to say how long in advance readers should request materials. Essentially, the more information you give, the better. And I would say it's very important to make sure this information is as accurate as possible. Extending on from that, I would say also try and make sure that your catalogues and your descriptions are as helpful as possible. Cataloguing is a very time-consuming and skilled task, but sometimes small extra details can make a big difference. And cataloguing an entire collection is very time consuming, but updating a collection level description, even just tagging it a little better or adding additional details into the access conditions, I think can sometimes make a big difference. And it might be the sort of information that either encourages or saves someone from a long trip. Often the catalogue will be the first thing that readers see, and I think it's really important that the information in that is as good as possible. Secondly, I would say know your collections and catalogues as well as possible. This can be immensely helpful when responding to questions and queries on the spot that you're maybe having to respond to without access to your computer. Often people will ask you things in question and you want to try give them the best advice possible. And I also recommend listening to and communicating as clearly as possible. Some readers will struggle to explain what they're looking for, and I'd recommend being patient and helping them where possible. On that note, I would also say just generally be kind and try and encourage future access. I personally think the compliment a reader or any sort of customer can provide is actually coming back. That's the highest compliment I think you can get. And I also can't emphasize how important it is to keep stats on what collections are being accessed and how long it takes you to find materials, etc. As this can help you improve your service. It may be that if a certain collection is being accessed a lot more than others, there could be a case of storing that location closer to your reading room, or even digitizing it so people can access it more online, and it might reduce the physical handling of that said collection. And on that note, I would also recommend taking any user feedback where you can, maybe even anonymous if you want it to be more honest, and using that feedback to think of ways you can improve your services. Okay, so now a very brief case study of a reading service that I provided and an analysis of what went well and what did not go so well. So a few years ago, I was in a position where I worked in a place that held an abundance of census records and electoral registers. And one time we had a request from a woman from America who was looking to research her family history, which originated from Scotland. She requested a number of materials and I was able to help her. There were a few things that went well with this and some that I think could have went a lot better. So in terms of what went well, I was able to listen to her very carefully and figured out what she wanted when she was not sure how to describe it herself. So for example, it was clear that she wanted to see census records, but she didn't know the term for this, and I was able to help her figure that out. Another thing that I think went well, and actually this isn't from this example, this is just something generally from that role, is we were able to think about making our collections more accessible to people with disabilities. So when I worked in that position, we had systems set up so people could give us feedback on our services, and from that feedback we were able to consider ways we could make our collections more accessible for people who maybe had visual disorders or maybe people who had physical disorders in terms of if they were accessing in wheelchairs, etc. So that was actually one example of how feedback led to a better and more inclusive service. In terms of what went better from this example, our website lacked details and we actually provided online services which she could have used from America. So that was a bit disappointing. She still got a lot from visiting us in person, but there was some stuff that we could have made available to her online, and it could have actually saved her a lot of time. And also, I was personally unclear of exactly what we held in this archive. I hadn't been there for that long, and this actually stalled progress a wee bit. This was as much a learning process for me as it was for her. And in the end, we did find a lot of materials, and the project went very well, and she was very happy. But those were small examples that I think could have went better. So anyway, that covers the entire video. I hope this has been useful. And if you have any questions or comments, feel more than free to post them below. Thanks again. And if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could like, subscribe and share. And also just to remind you that I would be absolutely delighted to take any requests for future videos also.